Welcome back to No More Strangers. Today's guest is Bill Bradford, a man I've had the privilege of knowing and learning from over the past 7 years. While Bill and I first crossed paths professionally at Beachbody in 2017, I later learned that our ancestors, William Brewster and Governor William Bradford, had worked together centuries ago, a discovery that made our eventual meeting feel like a continuation of something much older. In this conversation, Bill shares his perspective on leadership, faith, and the Christian values that guide him in life. His beliefs are not just a foundation, they're woven into the way he leads, mentors, and approaches every challenge. From our shared experiences in the digital world to reflections on purpose, responsibility, and the intersections of faith and leadership, this episode offers a blend of personal stories and deeply held convictions. Whether you're curious about the role of faith in shaping leadership or simply want to hear from someone who leads with heart and humility, I think you'll find something meaningful here. So let's get started. Here's my conversation with Bill Bradford. Right. We're on. But yeah, so you're asking about Devin Townsend and if I'm a fan.
Yeah.
And so you said you just saw him with Dream Theater
and Animals as Leaders. Yeah.
Wow.
Fantastic show. And he's so confident on stage. Have you seen him?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I saw him with his, gosh, what was the original band he was?
Devin Townsend Project.
Before that, this little Canadian band that the big hit, in my opinion, was a song called Love with a question mark at the end. And it's very heavy and it's a little bit emotionally charged, but also a little bit sort of knocking on the idea of what love is. It's a lot of fun to listen to.
Have you ever heard him interviewed by this woman who her handle is the charismatic voice?
I love that.
Jarkov.
Yeah.
That interview where he because I know that you love the Pacific Northwest.
I do.
And he lives up there. He's Canadian.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the Vancouver side. And he was talking about how the changes in weather and actually some of the grays actually helped his creative process.
Yeah. It very, very similar to what Stephen was referring to when I talked with him for the first conversation. It affects the songwriting, the lyrics, the mood of what you're doing. And I think you can get that in almost any environment. Like folks that go right in the desert probably have a very different archetypal structure to their music or their sound or their thought than somebody that lives up in the dense Pacific Northwest, right?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And think about you can press this too far, but because there's a lot of creativity that does come out of Hollywood, because I used to work there.
For sure.
The LA, the Hollywood sunshine all the time, it doesn't bring you to the same, set of emotions that a cold, dark winter might, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you wonder if that limits any of the creativity coming out of that town.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way. I'd always looked at Hollywood as trying to produce corporate and accessible music. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of the music that I listen to comes from, Scandinavia, right? Where it's cold and dark and there's a lot of despair to it, but there's so much beauty that comes from it. I think you get a similar beauty from the Pacific Northwest.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember some of our early conversations. I was surprised to find out that you were actually a prog rock fan.
Oh, yes.
Like, how did you get there?
Boy, that's a great question. How did I get there? I guess
it's not accessible for a lot of people.
Maybe my gateway drug was Queensryche because they were enough metal, but because Queensryche also were playing all these weird time signatures, and that combined with Jeff Tate's voice, I was hooked. And then once you start listening to Queensryche, it's a gateway to other artists that are in that world. I would say, and Rush, of course, the OG prog rock guys, and Yes.
I was hoping Yes would make that list.
Yes, absolutely. And just, I don't like the manufactured, the 3-minute and 20-second type of, type of music format. It's just not interesting to me. And, you can get some catchy tunes, but something that's got more staying power seems to have the ability to change signatures within within the song itself. I would say probably one of my favorite bands now is Dream Theater.
Yeah.
Because they're just the masters at this point. I think Rush was a lot of their inspiration, but they drew it from other, more heavy metal bands as well. But I just love that whole genre.
Not to rabbit hole. I love Dream Theater. If you heard their new single, where they've brought back,
Mike Portnoy.
Yeah.
So I just saw them in concert.
Oh God, right.
I was in Bratislava, Slovakia, 5 weeks ago. So I was in Vienna visiting my daughter, and then we took an hour-long train and spent the night in Bratislava so we can go see Dream Theater there. And it was amazing seeing Portnoy, because I'd seen Mike Mangini play with them probably like 10 times. But the first time I ever saw Dream Theater was back in the, late 90s at the 930 Club in D.C. And that was Portnoy back then.
You're blowing my mind, Bill.
Yeah. So Johnny Mayone had the same hair, but it was darker back then.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Yeah, my brother and I used to listen to Dream Theater while we were working at this place called Residence Artists, where we were basically sanding baseboards and prepping for painting.
Yeah.
And we would just be blasting Dream Theater.
Yes.
In these gigantic empty homes.
Yeah. And if you know, that's one of those things. I will say that you have to see the new concert, because they play Octavarium in full. So you have to go.
I have to go.
It's worth traveling for.
I haven't seen them since the first time I lived in California, where I had to drive up to Universal Studios to the amphitheater there.
Yeah.
And it was between the Buried in Me opening. I only caught the very end of them.
Mm-hmm.
And then Opeth, which this was right, I would say golden era Opeth.
Okay.
Right after Ghost Reveries, I believe. If that means anything to you. If not, that's fine too. And then Dream Theater played a medley from the first two albums.
Okay.
Which was a solid 10, 12 minutes of just my childhood.
So it was a shorter song.
It was, yeah. Yeah. Well, they had to blend all these songs from these albums that only a handful of the people there knew before moving into some of the more, they're at that point, more established, newer music.
Yes.
Man.
Yeah.
And the drum kit is,
oh yeah.
It's a miracle of science. I don't know any other way to put it.
And Portnoy not only has the ability to utilize the whole thing, but he's an entertainer as well. Like, he really knows how to engage the crowd from behind the drum kit.
Yeah.
As much as anybody I've ever seen.
I hope I'm not making up this memory, but I feel like they lifted the drum kit and had it sort of moving on the stage while he was playing.
Oh, really? I haven't seen that.
This was a long time ago.
Yeah.
It was pretty cool. Man. Yeah. Hey, Bill, thanks for that.
Get a little running start here.
Yeah, I love it. And thanks for letting me, stay here last night and hang out with you. It's
my pleasure.
I don't get to see you enough, or anybody anymore post-COVID, but I really appreciate it. It meant a lot to me. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thanks for making breakfast for my daughter.
Yeah, of course. I can't sit still.
Yeah.
Sir. I usually do a fairly explicit definition and introduction for people. I'm changing this up a little bit. I don't want to spoil who you are for anybody that doesn't know, and anybody that does know, the 12 people that are listening, welcome. Today on No More Strangers, obviously I'm joined by my friend and former colleague, Bill Bradford. Bill is, I would say, first and foremost, a Christian.
Yes.
A man of true faith. And I know a few of those, but that is, I think, one of the first things that comes to mind when I think about who Bill is. Before I knew that about him, though, I knew him as a leader of people, an exceptionally loving and patient man. What stood out for me constantly was his love for his family and his friends, and the compassion that he showed for the people and the teams that he built. And it was something that inspired me, and I've quite literally inspired me to reconsider elements of how I was living my life and where my focus had been.
Wow. I'd love to hear about that.
Well, we can talk about it.
Yeah,
life is an evolution.
Yeah. Gosh, that's flattering, I'll say. But yeah, I would love to know what that impact was.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and you sat through hearing some of the elements of my life, and that gave me a different appreciation for a lot of things. And going totally off script here because the rest of this is largely irrelevant. We can just roll right into it. One of the first things that you really caught me off guard with, I said something fairly flip around the idea of, well, come on, nobody truly knows themselves, which was a bit of a projection on my part because it was a point in my life where I'm pretty sure I didn't know who I was anymore, or perhaps never really had given it thought. And your response stuck with me, and I still think about it way too frequently. Your response was explicitly, well, I know myself. And you stunned me. Usually it's hard for me to shut up.
Wow.
And I was pacing on the other side of your desk, just chatting. I think I don't remember what all was going on. It's not relevant, but I sort of stopped and put my hands on the chair across from where you were sitting as you were prepping something for a meeting. And I was just struck by that. And I clearly haven't prepped you on this, but I'm very curious what that means to you to know yourself.
Boy, this could be probably 8-10 hour conversation.
Let's go.
Let's see what happens. I'm going to think as I speak because I'll say what comes to me naturally in answering that question. I think that if you know what your identity is, and not only who you are, but whose you are, that basically defines who you are. Okay, so I am a Christian. I believe that I was created by God for a purpose. I was intelligently designed by God's handiwork, just as every human being on earth has been. And he breathed the spirit of life into me when he saved me from my sin. And so now I know I've been purchased by the blood of Christ. And so I am no longer my own. I am his possession. And my job here is to bring him glory, right? And so are there deep, dark corners of my mental psyche that I haven't explored yet? I'm sure there are. But as far as knowing who I am, I think it starts with whose I am. And I am not my own. I've been purchased. Okay. So therefore, it even in scripture talks about we are seated in the heavenlies with Christ. And so there's a royal sonship that comes from that understanding of, God himself adopted me into his family. And so that trounces any kind of identity as far as what's my career and, how much money I have or don't have. It's all about, wow, I've been adopted into the family of God. That's my identity. And so that's the way I would answer that.
Sure.
So I'll reinforce that doesn't mean that I've got everything completely figured out, but I know who I am.
Okay. And I think that last piece to me, it strikes me as a very important distinction. You don't have everything figured out. And I don't know that any of us does. I don't trust anybody that claims to.
Right.
And my initial interpretation of the question of does anybody truly know themselves would have also been one which led to me to distrust, because the idea that in order to know yourself, you have to know the whole thing.
Mm.
And I think the way you framed it makes sense to me. I'm thinking about this sort of out loud, which isn't fair to anybody that's listening. But it's an interesting mechanism or approach to basically say, yeah, I know I don't know everything, but I at least know who I am. And I had never separated those two concepts before.
Yeah.
So this is interesting for me in real time.
So like your ontology is not defined by your epistemology, if you want to get really technical, right?
Sure.
Your ontological nature of like what you are is not defined by the full breadth of, infinite understanding and comprehensive understanding of every little corner so that everything's in a tidy little box. I don't think that those two are necessarily related. Well, they may be related, but they are not the same.
Sure.
That makes sense?
It does make sense. And it's somewhat at odds with the way I tend to approach everything in my life, right? Where you may or may not have recognized this in me at some point. But for me to know things means to understand the systems at play within, and understanding those interrelationships. which leads maybe not to an explicit understanding of everything, but at least the capacity to work your way towards that understanding on a certain level. And I think what you're saying is that that's not a requirement.
No, it's not.
Yeah. A lot of people tell me this, by the way. I get called out a lot.
But you wonder if that's what makes you a really good data guy.
Oh, maybe.
Right. And because understanding things in as far as systems and input and outputs, and there's data that basically measures that. That's the metric that measures that relationship. I think that may be what really makes you a really awesome data guy. That's what I'm thinking.
I appreciate the use of awesome there. Yeah, thank you. And now I'm, sort of drawn towards how you got there. One of the core concepts or questions that I like to ask everybody that I sit down with, even off podcast, right? Like, how did you, Bill Bradford, come to that understanding of yourself, I think? And who were you prior to that? I understand that you didn't always have this faith or conviction.
Right.
And coming to it, I always find is an interesting discussion, or at least an interesting thought process.
Yeah.
Most people that I speak with, and I related a little bit about this last night, at least Americans that I speak with, have this background of a baseline of Christianity in their experience. And again, I come from Northeast Ohio, where that is the de facto mode. It's where people were, it's where people are. But there's a level of distinction between being born into a big old air quotes faith versus finding true belief, I guess you could call it. And to the point I was making, you didn't start out fully, no one starts out fully formed in their faith or their understanding of reality, religion, faith, experience. Where would you like to start on that story? I was going to start us in your childhood, but I don't know if that's really necessary.
Well, it probably is helpful because I did grow up when in my family, Christianity was in the water. I grew up Lutheran, very devout family. We went to church every week. Father was a president of the congregation, and our friends were our friends from church. And so if anybody asked me back then, are you Christian? I absolutely would have said yes. And because I saw Christianity as a set of theological boundaries, and I would have defended it, with anybody who would have said anything against Christianity, because I was defending a theoretical system as opposed to a person.
Sure.
And it wasn't until, and it was the kind of faith that it's easy to be plucked out of you once the real world hits you outside of the bubble of living in that kind of system.
Yes.
I don't necessarily want to go through all the twists and turns because it was probably not that interesting, other than the fact that my faith, and I don't even like the word faith because faith makes it seem like a blind leap in the dark, and it's not. It's a living trust, is the way I like to say it. It became real for me in a very stereotypical kind of way, where, and actually I'll back up a little bit. Even when I went to West Point, I went to chapel every week. I had incredible encounters with the living God, within even the beauty of the West Point Chapel and the preaching of the word. I was part of Navigators, which is a very, really interesting, it's an organization, but basically they have a method and a framework for going deeper in your faith. But I would say that it still wasn't real for me, as far as I was defending the concept of Jesus. I wasn't in a relationship with Jesus, if that makes sense.
It does.
And so back to my stereotypical conversion story, I was out of West Point. I was a young lieutenant down in Fort Eustis, Virginia. My new bride, my wife of 31 years now, she was out for the evening with some other ladies that were also officers' wives. And I happened to be watching television at home. It's like our little 19-inch RCA uh, television, and a Billy Graham crusade was on television. And if anybody everybody's heard of Billy Graham, but basically he was an evangelist, worldwide renowned. But he was saying something on the television in this message that God used to basically seize my heart. And at that moment, I was like, oh, this is real. It's not just, and I believe that only God can do that. He can quicken your spirit, because in your own strength or in your own will, you can't will the Spirit of God to come into you. It's something that God, he regenerates your heart. And he did that in that little apartment in Newport News, Virginia. And I was like, oh, it's real. And life has never been the same. So, and I've grown in my understanding and knowledge of my faith, and I've pursued a master's degree in Christian apologetics. So I just want to learn more and more, but it's not just so I can know more, it's so I can know him more, know Christ, my Savior, more. Okay. So it's, and like I said, and things have never been the same ever since then. So I didn't know Christ personally before. I knew him as a thought, as a framework. Now I know him as the person that he is, the real true Son of God.
It's super interesting to me, because I my opinions in general on televangelism, and for-profit spirituality or religion. And yet what you're sort of maybe explicitly saying here is that maybe not explicitly and maybe not in so many words, but there is a utility there. There's it's not a bad thing that they exist, potentially, or maybe there could have been another way for you to have your direct communion conversation with God, and to find Jesus. But in this case, that was, I guess we could say, the catalyzing event.
I would say I agree with you in that when Christians, I put them in scare quotes, use the name of Christ for fundraising purposes and it's quote for profit.
Sure.
I have a real problem with that as well. I don't necessarily view Billy Graham in that light. I think he was just an incredible, gifted speaker who was an incredible evangelist, and then basically filled stadiums of people and many, many people were saved, right?
Yeah.
But I never gave him $1, right?
Yeah.
Right. But there are people that are out there that abuse the name of Christ, and I think it's evil and think it's awful if Jesus was to show up, if he was to return that day and show up at some of these events, I think he'd be disgusted. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's not who I am, and he was a humble servant, and he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And yet if you see televangelists, like we have a clown that lives here in Fort Worth that flies in private jets and all this kind of stuff, and says that it's his duty to be rich. I'm like, that's, I don't know what Bible you're reading.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I one of the other elements here, I mean, it's an interesting thought experiment for me. Military service plus service to God. And I don't necessarily see them as, how do I want to say it? They're not antithetical completely, but I have questions about it.
Sure.
Because, well, and you can imagine exactly what those questions would be. The idea of the military presumably being potentially defense of the country, but in actuality, it seems to be more imposition of the strength or the will of the nation against the rest of the world.
Yes.
And how do you, and I'm not asking you to, stand in defense of one side or the other. I'm more curious about how you make that make sense in your own mind, or how that works for you. And this is no way a judgment. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I would say first and foremost, I think that the scriptures celebrate the role of soldiers. Even David is a warrior
Sure.
king, right? God commanded the Israelites to eradicate evil from the land of Canaan. The amount of evil that was going on there was horrific.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the and there's the centurion was one of the first converts. The Roman centurion was one of the first Christian converts, and so it is something that as a profession it is celebrated, and just war is in fact a good thing if you are defending what is right and eradicating evil.
Sure.
Where it gets very questionable is if the projection of power using the military is for illicit gain by our country. There's some real questionable things there, and you can't just hang your hat on like, oh, he's serving his country. Like, because I do believe that we as in the United States have projected power in very illicit ways, and not necessarily for the benefit of just defending our people, right? It's more about, global hegemony. And so as a Christian man, if I was still serving, that would be a difficult thing. It's not tidy at all. I'm glad there's Christians that are serving in the military. I still have a lot of friends that are classmates of mine. But yeah, there's some things that we've done. It's like, wait, no, what were we doing? Like Vietnam, like, and the lies that got us into Vietnam.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a just war. Were there bad people that we had taken out as part of that? And did we eradicate some evil? Probably, yes. But as a overall, yeah, it's more of like, as a country, are we adhering to just war theory? That's one of the things that we learned at West Point.
Okay.
And sometimes yes, sometimes no. I would say that's maybe a broad way to answer it. And it's not a tidy equation that you can just say, oh yeah, well, I'm just serving my country, I'm just wearing the uniform, I'm just doing what I'm told, because we know where that can end up.
And a lot of people
look
do
at
that.
Nuremberg.
Yeah. Ordinary men, right?
Yes.
That being said, I suspect, and maybe this is projection from the way I used to observe the world and move through it, that people do seek that tidy sort of stable construction and say, well, I'm just doing this and I'm just doing this. And I think it's a fairly common approach to dealing with the world as we find ourselves in it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mind? I had never heard the term just war theory.
Yeah.
And I love what it suggests. Do you mind expanding on what that means? Or
yeah, I mean, basically, from a very, very high level, if your country is being attacked by a foreign aggressor, it's absolutely just in order to project power, in order to eradicate that and push back on that. And so there is a calculus, a certain equation as far as there is just war, but then there is unjust war when you are just doing it as a country or as a political entity for undue gain, that basically projecting power, causing death, causing destruction, causing harm, and the trail of tears that's left behind just because of your political aspiration. So I think I have to brush up on some of the more technical details of just war theory, but we studied it at West Point, and it's like, I think it was just basically a reminder that when we are going into putting on the uniform and obeying orders from the civilian leadership, that basically we need to think about what we are doing in the framework of is what we're doing moral, right? And if it's not, it should at least absolutely put a stone in your shoe. It's like, wait, what are we doing here? And I guess I could delve deeper, but I think
that's a good high level. Yeah. And it also brings to mind, I mean, we look at the ways that people attempt to frame any given conflict as a just war. I don't have enough details, and maybe you can speak on it, but our incursions into Iraq following 9/11 looked like they were framed up to be part of or following that just war theory. But in retrospect, we find that it had nothing to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was another one of these wars that we were basically lied into, and there was carnage that came from it. And we, a lot of times, unfortunately, we see these things in the rearview mirror, and the political powers that be have the bully pulpit in order to be able to uh, project basically their truth of why we're doing this, and it turns out that stuff was all fabricated, you know, and so and you can look what happened, 20 years later, and the war on terror. I don't think we won it.
I don't think we're even trying to win it.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's more about, there's other goals. There's, regional hegemony in the Middle East and all this stuff, but
massive transfers of wealth from everyone
defense
to few
contractors, really, it's a bull market if you're in that world, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We all chose the wrong career if we wanted to be rich.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. I suppose there are a few different ways we can go here. You had mentioned Christian apologetics.
Yes.
And I had heard you speak somewhat on it. I think you did at the beginning of the year, maybe in February down in West Palm Beach.
Yes.
And I had to go look up what that meant. It wasn't something I was familiar with at all. And I'm skeptical that many people are familiar with apologetics as how do you even describe it, as a branch of Christianity, as a specialization within, or it's a rhetorical framework, isn't it?
So apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means to give a rational defense for something, right? So it's basically, there's a reasonableness to the Christian faith. And so it's historically sound, it's theologically, it is coherent. There is, from a philosophical framework, we don't have contradictions. And so the world of Christian apologetics, basically there's a couple different camps without getting too technical, but the evidentialist camp is like, hey, you know what? There's actual good historical reasons why we believe that Jesus in fact rose from the dead. And this is why we know this, X, Y, and Z. Jesus of Nazareth did exist. He did have a following. He was crucified on a Roman cross. We know this through not only the gospel accounts, which sometimes can be spiritualized away, but these were just eyewitness accounts written by the writers of the New Testament that were assembled into what we call the New Testament, but they were individual letters, right? And they were primary source accounts of what actually happened. So we do know that Christ was crucified on a Roman cross. And not just gospel writers, but other historical authors at the time have referenced it as well. We do know that at least some people thought that they saw him resurrected, right? Yeah. And so, so what can explain that? Is it mass hallucination? Well, no, actually, from psychologists will tell you that that's actually not a thing, a mass hallucination. They are individualized, and so so you basically you have to basically wave away the hallucination theory. There's the swoon theory. Okay, so he just almost died, but he actually didn't die on the cross, and he resurrected within the tomb because he wasn't fully dead yet.
I hadn't heard that
Python.
Yeah, that makes, I'm not dead yet. Right.
Yeah. I'm not dead yet. So basically, but this is the kind of things that apologetics does, is it equips the Christian, it strengthens their faith, because there's always people taking pot shots on it. It's like, oh my gosh, Jesus didn't exist. Well, actually, the historians would disagree with you. It's like, well, he didn't really die. Well, actually, yes, he did. And we have all these different accounts. Well, he didn't rise from the dead. Well, we have, at least people thought they saw him. And in fact, Paul talks in 1 Corinthians about over 500 people saw him alive. And so the people that were receiving this letter would have been in a position to say, well, actually, yeah, we did. Cool. Or if he didn't, then we're like, no, Paul, you're full of crap. Yeah. So it's these types of things. Another thing that apologetics has delved into is like the world of like special creation. So like, how did we get here? How do we have the specified complexity that our bodies are created down to the cellular and even subcellular level? Like, how did that all happen? Well, do we evolve just from a primordial soup, or was there some special intervention and design for creating these little machines of mitochondria in our body? Like, that's the kind of thing that helps to strengthen and give resilience to the Christian's faith, especially when they go off to college and all their professors are telling them that they're a bunch of numbnuts for believing what their parents did. But now that they're getting educated by these,
Right.
people with their sheepskins, that they can just leave that Christianity to the side and go live a real life. And that's, so in the world of apologetics, we attempt to provide a resilient framework for Christians and to defend against heresies that creep in. And that's been going on for 2,000 years.
Sure. Sure. And when it comes to the procedural mechanical approaches that are taught at universities, I don't think that they're necessarily wrong, but I rather suspect that there's a bit of myopia in that what we describe through the sciences is simply the methodology by which things came to pass, but not necessarily giving any credence or thought to why it may have come to pass. We tend to see, and I'm not a scientist.
Yeah.
Not in that regard, I should say. How do I want to say this, Bill? We look at the processes, but we frequently have to make assumptions as to what was the catalyzing effect. You hear theories about a lightning strike in a primordial ooze or goo that happened to lead to XYZ in an evolutionary path, but it doesn't necessarily need to have been that way. The idea of intelligent design is something I find to be very interesting. And as a child, even, I would think about it in terms of, well, sure, evolution makes sense from a mechanistic viewpoint of reality or nature, but why must we dismiss the idea that there was intent behind that? Just because we can only observe the steps doesn't mean that we have a high enough level of perception.
Yes.
To say that there was no intention or intellect behind it.
Yeah, and I think that that's definitely a rabbit hole here, but there's definitely different kinds of evolution just from a macro perspective. There's macroevolution and there's microevolution, and I don't think any intelligent design theorist would dismiss the fact that microevolution, like within a species, that organisms adapt over time, and that's actually built into the framework of how we have been, in fact, created, is like we have the adaptability. But as far as macro evolution, as far as a toad turning ultimately into a turkey one day, like there's too many leaps within the evolutionary chain in order to get there, and too much outside complexity that would need to be kind of infused into the system in order to make that chain of events happen, so that this one organism can turn into something completely different, like the feathers developing out of like nowhere. I just think that there is, on the macroevolutionary scale, I think there's just too many leaps in the dark, and Darwinian theorists now, amongst themselves, they are saying that kind of the gig is up a little, and they're looking for other frameworks because it's just too much complexity that would need to be injected into the system. So a lot of different things have been trying to explain away all this complexity. It's like, but time plus chance doesn't necessarily mean that you have a designer with those two elements.
And in defense of any of these observational materialistic frameworks, they do require some level of observable, repeatable processes.
Yes.
In order to say anything, and anything that they can't measure has to be, I understand this, has to be removed from their scientific process. Like, I don't disagree with the way that they come to their conclusions, just based on the way that they are required to think in order to produce the results that are necessary for their work. And I used the framework of myopia just moments ago. I don't know how to reconcile those two things in a scalable fashion without falling back to what we essentially described earlier as faith, which is, it's a difficult square to circle, or circle to square.
Circle to square, yeah.
Yeah.
I would say, I would add one thing is, like, actually it's the scientific method is actually really, it was pioneered by Christians, because the Christians were looking to think God's thoughts after him, and they're the ones that were actually, and have been really all about exploring God's universe that he has created. It's basically, but now science can turn into scientism, meaning the only word, the only knowledge that we have can be measured in a laboratory, right?
Right.
So it's also called empiricism. If you can't measure it, it doesn't actually exist. But that in itself is a philosophical construct because you can't measure that statement.
That's right.
Right. And so they're smuggling in philosophy and a theoretical framework into what they're calling science. And one of the most famous things in like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins is talks about how the universe that we see, it looks like it was designed, but it can't be because there is no designer. So he's waving
a blanket statement.
It's a blanket statement. So he's got a lot of faith, right?
That is one way to put it. Yeah,
he's got a lot of faith. That's a blind leaf in the dark, but it is based upon a philosophical assumption. I think a lot of times people don't want it to be true because that would mean that there's a creator that they're answerable to, and I think that's what suppresses a lot of good thinking sometimes. So
I think I agree with that because it is exactly as you described it, a different form of blind faith.
Yes.
And one that is sort of inculcated under the guise of wisdom and knowledge.
Yes.
And tends to lead, as many forms of faith do, to this interesting superiority complex, which one of the frameworks that we were discussing earlier is the othering of people who are different or think differently, and then can be made less than appear.
Yes.
Which leads to a lot of the things which we need military for. Not to force that back into the conversation.
Yes. It's interesting to see in the past several hundred years, it used to be that theology was the queen of the sciences, and that philosophy was her handmaiden, and all the different academic disciplines led up to the superstructure, the fact that God created all this and it's ordered. And by philosophy, we can think properly about how all these different disciplines relate. And even the concept of a university was to create unity out of the diverse disciplines. So unity in diversity.
I hate that I never put that together.
Whereas now, all of the different disciplines are so siloed, right? They're stovepiped. And so the average scientist just is not trained in philosophy to know even how to think about what they are pursuing, right? They'll get just a basic understanding of the scientific method, which has a philosophical underpinning. Why should an experiment be repeatable? Why is there order in the universe that we can rely upon that would inform the scientific method, right? So that's a philosophical underpinning, but they would want to kind of put philosophy in the humanities department and just some kind of weird people that like to stare,
all the best classes were philosophy.
Exactly.
Like, well, that's where you get to actually, my opinion, whatever. So maybe this is an impossible ask, but how, in your opinion, maybe, how would we go about rectifying that? Because it feels like yet another presumably broken system.
Oh boy, how do you fix the academic system? I'm not smart enough to know how to do that. I think you have to create alternatives, but there's such a power structure in there as far as accreditation. I'll give you an example. My daughter's school, Hillsdale College, thinks this way. They've ordered their academic environment along these lines, and basically pursuing the good, true, and beautiful. And they go to primary source materials as opposed to textbooks that people have written that are kind of an editorial structure on top of what they want people to perceive as far as what reality is. They go back to the source. And I think that different universities like that you can get a wonderful education, but by and large, the American university system, and not just American, but I would say European, is largely compromised. And so you have different doctoral candidates that are given their PhDs by other PhDs and all that are just part of the system. And
it's sort of self-reinforcing.
It is self-reinforcing. And I think maybe what it is you got to get the government out of the whole student loan thing, because once they start to attach purse strings to different, to universities, they can control what's actually being taught there, and they can control accreditation
through grant writing.
Exactly.
All the incentivization that comes through our current academic world.
Yes.
Is tied to those things.
Yeah.
And because of that, it also comes down to other isms, other belief structures of those who hold those purse strings or can sign those checks.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think there's only 2 universities in the United States that don't take federal grant money. It's
Seriously?
Hillsdale and Grove City, and that's it. Everyone else,
That's appalling.
yeah. That's
And
it.
also it makes sense.
Yep.
Because these universities are all for profit at this point.
And look at how expensive they are now because of the whole, infusion of cash, via the whole student loan system, and they just keep raising the rates, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of boxes out the average layman who might want to go to school, but they don't have access to or they don't want to go spend $200,000 in debt to go get a humanities degree. Yeah.
I mean, it better be a heck of a humanities degree.
Yeah.
I don't know how you pay that off. There are jokes here about going and being a barista for 30 years, but I don't think that's really useful. Wow, I'm appalled that there's only 2. I will get off of that in a moment, I'm sure. So one of the ways that you've been speaking of some of the things that you do in your life, and this isn't probably the best way to frame it, but I hear you use the word ministry a lot.
Yeah.
And you've used it in the framework of describing your family or your approach to it. I believe I've heard you in the past refer to your approach to leadership as a form of ministry. It's not a framework I've ever encountered before when thinking about that word itself. What does ministry mean when you use it?
There's the Puritans came up with this term that really tried to capture all this. It's called vocation. Voca is calling.
Sure.
Right? So your vocation is your calling. And what it was in the spirit of trying to break down the barrier between the clergy and the laity, which had been kind of calcified and reinforced through the Roman Church. And so basically we talked about the priesthood of all believers. And so where God has placed us strategically is for his purposes. And so everything that we do is ministry. Everything that we are doing is to model after our leader, who is Jesus. And he was the ultimate servant leader, right? So what we are doing is we are ministering to those under our care. Doesn't mean that all you're doing is just serving the people and you're not serving a business goal. Those two are not necessarily in contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
But in pursuing a goal, a business goal, a financial outcome, for example, you are best going to be effective in doing that by taking care of the people underneath you, under your care.
Okay.
In order to pursue that end. And so that's the way I've tried to lead my teams that I've built over time. Is don't see them as cogs in the wheel. Don't see them as like numbers on an Excel spreadsheet, like private equity firms will look at people, right? Look at them as individual people that have a soul and they're under your care. And so one of my favorite compliments I've ever gotten was, won't name her name, but she was on our team at Beachbody, but she said, "Bill, you're the pastor of this division." And I said, "I will receive that."
I recall hearing that said.
Yeah. And so I'll receive, but I'm not, tooting my own horn. What I'm saying is that's my approach to the workplace. It is, there's not like a special thing like, oh, I'm a minister. Just means that you're ordained for the purpose of full-time ministry.
Right. We
are all ministers that are in the church that are the body believers, and we all have our strategic places to be. And I heard a very disappointing talk. This woman one time who was a executive at an insurance company, she stepped down from her role. She's like, "Yeah, I was just pursuing a corporate world, but I wanted to do something for God, and so I left that role, and now I'm working for the church." And like, boy, oh boy, were in a strategic place of leadership and influence that you could like care and care for those people under your world. And if all the Christians departed the workplace and they all wanted to just work for churches,
right?
That's not great. That's not what we're called. We're called to be salt and light out into the world in the marketplace.
That's a really interesting perspective, or at least to me it is, because a lot of folks that I talk with frequently bemoan the fact that most of the work that we do it seems ostensibly to be to enrich the already wealthy class. no matter whom we're working for within the corporate world, or in my case as a consultant. I mean, I've had to enrich people that work in the gambling industry.
Mhm.
I've worked for other large corporations, and it feels like all we do is enrich other people at the expense of the customers, not treating the customers or the teams as people or individuals, rather seeing them as a farmable
Yes.
resource. And there's this massive, almost despair. The people that I'm speaking with about this, and it crosses different faiths, different religions, different spiritualities. And the urge is always to get out from that system. And what you're suggesting in your comment is that there are better ways to move through those circles, to move in those spaces in ways that, and I would say this regardless of religious or spiritual predilections, there are opportunities to improve humanity even in those positions.
Yes.
And I'm curious how one would also manage to find success or capacity in spreading that. Let's call it goodwill. Let's call it love, because that's one of my
Sure.
big things. How can you position things? Maybe this isn't the right question, but how can one be put into a position in which they can influence those outcomes while still maintaining that core construct of love or compassion or Christianity, even in those spaces, especially in some of the places that we've worked?
It's a great question. Like, basically, how can we be put into positions of influence so that we can, in fact, be influential, right?
Essentially,
And,
yeah.
right.
That's better said than mine.
Yeah, and I wish I had the magic formula to that. I like to say about my own career that it just kind of happened to me, that I never really had any career goals.
I understand that.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly like my next goal was to work with people that I really enjoyed and try to work on something really cool,
Yeah.
and to basically use my gifts to help build teams that we not only work together hard, but we have relationships with that persist beyond that particular job, right? And so, and it just, my career just kind of happened to me, kind of the accidental executive. But
I definitely want to go into that.
yeah, so I don't have the magic formula. Obviously, in the system that we live in, obviously the degrees are important because they basically open doors for you, but you also, there's also relationships that you need to build. And if you treat people well, I think they will treat you well back, hopefully.
Yeah.
And but sometimes you get burned, sometimes you get screwed, but that's the way, unfortunately, the world is. It's not necessarily tidy. So,
I think you may have inadvertently actually answered the question while stating that you don't have any magical formula for it. Because I think what I would distill from what you said is just continue to live your life true to yourself in regard to the values that you hold, and showcase that while being in those situations, and you can then influence those around you in a positive way.
yeah.
And I say that a little bit potentially in a self-aggrandizing way, because that's how I try to operate when I'm in those spaces, by showing love and respect, and I may fail at that because I'm human too. But
We
I
all
think
do.
that may be part of, I think that may actually be the answer to that question.
You
The
bloom
way
where
you
you're
frame.
bloom where you're planted.
Yeah.
Is that a way?
I've heard people say that.
Yeah.
I never really think about, no, that's not true. I've thought about it a little bit, but I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Would we call that an aphorism? I'm not sure.
It could be an aphorism, but yeah, it's the kind of thing like, if you're going to have angst your whole life if you basically have this ideal that's out there, and if you haven't absolutely achieved that ideal, that perfect job, that perfect whatever, you're always going to have this angst. That's the way the Germans would say it. This angst, as opposed to bloom where you're planted, and thrive in the place that you've been put. And life is dynamic and different things change and all of that. But if you can be true to yourself, I think you're gonna be a more integrated self, as opposed to just kind of always longing for something that's probably not achievable.
Yeah, I agree with that. So one of the elements that we've only briefly touched on is your approach to leadership, and I'm curious because you mentioned West Point, and I know that was a large focus of your life once you got in. What are your principles of leadership? What are your sort of North Star elements when it comes to leading people, building teams? You mentioned treating people with respect and as people instead of cogs in the machine.
Yeah.
Do you mind
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple principles. So we talked about it a little bit before, but servant leadership. I remember the head of military instruction at West Point when I was there, was a legendary guy named Colonel Tex Turner. And Tex used to be the commandant of the Ranger School.
Oh, wow.
And it turns out when I graduated, he was living in Newport News. And so I got to spend a decent amount of time with him when I was stationed at Fort Eustis. And I remember, sitting drinking scotch with him and him relating stories from West Point. I'm sorry, from Vietnam. He was, I think I don't know if he was a major or lieutenant colonel back then, but anyway, leading troops over there and talking about the importance of leading as a servant. And so always, not just commanding them to go perform a particular action, but you being willing to go out in front and lead them in that action. And if they saw that you were the real deal and that you didn't think of them as just cogs in the wheel, if you thought of them as people, as soldiers, as incredibly valuable human beings, he said they will run through walls for you. And so it's all about valuing the soldiers, number one. But number two is, and I think this applies not only to the military, but also into the corporate world, it's called decentralized command. So meaning that you empower small unit teams to do their job and you don't micromanage them.
Mm-hmm.
So we've all experienced those people that at a corporate level love to micromanage, but think about it in a military context. If you're a general, you can't go down all the way down to the unit level on a company level, platoon, squad, little team, and in place the aiming stakes for that one soldier who's got his M16 pointed out in the perimeter. He's got to know his left boundary and his right boundary, right? And it's got to have interlocking fields of fire to the guy next to him and the guy next to him. So you rely upon your team leaders in order to make sure that they're all properly integrated and coordinated. And then the team leaders report up to the squad leader, who then has a squad under the command. And then the platoon leader, has a whole platoon, but they basically are using these sub-elements all the way up to the general. He's got to empower small unit leaders to do their job with them and to give them flexibility to think within their range of motion, within their area of responsibility, because otherwise you have a very rigid infrastructure. You have people that are not willing to go try things, to be able to react to things on the ground that you are not going to be able to perceive from up on high. You need to have the generals, but you need to have empowered soldiers on the ground that know that they can be creative within their aiming stakes. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense.
And so in the corporate world, the people that micromanage are the people that don't understand this. And somebody that has to review every single darn design as a CEO, as opposed to saying, hey, I've got a designer that I'm paying a lot of money to, that they know what they're doing. They actually went to school for this, and I'm going to trust them to be up on the latest design concept. And so, I'm not going to overrule, everything they do. Now you have 51% vote, but hopefully you don't have to exercise that because you've empowered your team and rewarded rewarded creativity and industry within the smaller parts of your organization. So that's where I try to run my orgs, is to make people feel valued and empowered to make decisions. And I'm there to have their back if something gets screwed up.
Yeah. And so you got to have so many thoughts on this, and how would, and maybe this is the wrong question, but on a systems level, whenever I've worked with folks with military experience, I find there is an effectiveness and an interest in collaboration. How would we go about getting folks that are moving into leadership positions for the first time? So you have this amazing software developer, and let's say, as happens frequently, we decide to promote them up out of their skill set into a separate skill set just because they're very good software developers. Doesn't make them any good as managers. And in fact, they may be incentivized to micromanage because that's where they understand, maybe not directly incentivized, but their predilection may be, well, I know how to do this code, so I'm going to fall back on what I know how to do rather than training them appropriately. How terrible question, I'm sure. How can we affect that sort of a change on the corporate level in some sort of management training? Is that an option? Are there military style training sessions available?
Yeah, there absolutely are. And there's a lot of different ex-military guys that have even consultancies that focus on this. I think that training is often, just overlooked. It's like it sits within HR and nobody cares about HR. It's just like they're there to make sure that you don't get in legal trouble when you
That's
hire
right.
and fire people.
That's right.
And so since training it just kind of sits over in the world of HR, people don't really value it as opposed to being a strategic weapon that can be utilized, to make a more effective organization. Because human resources is the lifeblood of a company, but typically it's not viewed like that within it because they're not utilized or even trained to be a partner to help effectuate growing the business because you've empowered people to actually operate like I was talking about before.
Right.
So I think it's got to be training, it's modeling, it is setting a corporate climate from up above that I'm not going to be a micromanager, so you don't need to as well.
Right.
I do know, I've seen a lot of people that are individual contributors and they try to make the leap to be, okay, I'm a project manager now. And they feel guilty because they're not doing the individual tasks.
I resemble that. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So
Yeah.
You've lived it then, right? It's like, oh my gosh, because output is defined as, okay, I just wrote some code, as opposed to output being defined as I led a team in order that just created a great work product, and it works, and not a lot of bugs, things like, you know what I mean? And so
You got to find those KPIs, Bill.
and KPIs are a good thing. It's just, but I think it's more of a command climate that will create an effective organization. KPIs really measure it,
Right.
as opposed to the KPI is what we're all about.
Right. Yeah. And I as you were responding to that, I realized just how personally relevant that was for me, because I've been promoted into leadership positions several times with no training provided. And so I guess I was really speaking from my own experience, unfortunately, of falling back on what my strengths are in terms of what I'm good at. And then sometimes, loath to admit it here, I may micromanage at times.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting and anxiety riddled experience. It's fascinating. So I guess that was sort of a personal, how do I do this without going and joining the military at 45?
I will say that, I mean, you learn this really early on as a lieutenant, when you're in the military, because you're in charge of your entire platoon and all these people have a lot more experience than you. You're a butter bar. That's what they call us, right?
Yeah.
And, if you go in the motor pool and think that you're going to be an effective platoon leader, like by getting down and like changing, lug nuts on a tire, they're like, sir, what are you doing?
Mhm.
I got this.
Mhm.
You don't need to do that. It's like, okay, yeah. And so a lot of lieutenants make that mistake. It's like, okay, in order to be effective, I got to go turn a wrench. And that's not what you're there for.
Right.
You're there to lead and set the command climate and to give strategic direction and empower your NCOs in order to say, hey, this is what we're trying to do. Create a commander's intent and then give them flexibility to go and execute the mission within that intent.
Got it. And that actually answers other questions that I had, because you would be an example of this, I think. You hear executives say that they built a thing. So in your case, I would say it's arguable and reasonable to say that you helped to build, let's use an example, Hulu, right? It doesn't mean you were the one in there writing the code or designing the interface or any of that, but it was more the utility or the value of the leadership that you provided enabled the teams to be able to build something that now N% of the world uses. And it's not a small percentage.
Yeah, I mean, so my role was chief product officer of the launch team before it even had a brand name. But yeah, I mean, we pulled together about 100 people between Fox and NBC in order to even start that project. So we had, project management, designers, engineers, we had content people, we had QA people, we had designers, we had, and a lot of different vendor partners in order to assemble basically the structure that was then handed over to the team that then launched the product in production. But yeah, it wasn't me writing code, but I created the framework and the executive structure underneath me where people were empowered to go create policies. Like I remember the guy on my team who was an expert in ad policy, right? Like how many ads are we going to run for a 30-minute program versus an hour program? What do they do on TV? We don't want to do that. We want to be less, but how are we going to monetize this? Like all that kind of stuff. But I didn't have that expertise, but I know that we needed one. And so he was empowered to go make those decisions.
And you didn't feel the need or impetus to become the subject matter expert on something that you had no experience with.
Right.
You understood that you had to go find somebody that did and were capable of delegating.
Yes, exactly.
And that wherewithal literally came from your training and leadership in the military then.
Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, I just personally, I always used to wonder, what is it that executives are doing? Like I see them in their office and I can just walk in and talk to them, but they're never doing anything. What does this mean? Coming from a Midwest, like everybody's either a farmer or going to the factory kind of a world, right?
Yes.
Unless they're the sales team. And that's a whole different world that is terrifying, right? Except to some of our very good friends.
and sales, executives do a lot of stuff that are not necessarily understood or appreciated by the folks on the team. Like
that's an understatement,
fighting
Bill.
For budgets.
Yeah.
Like how to so that you're actually resourced to do your job.
Right.
And having to go to all the meetings that nobody would want to go to.
I have sat in those meetings and I don't want to go to them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Waiting to present the numbers, right?
Right.
That everyone's going to get mad at and argue about. But
yeah,
we've been there. I feel like we've milked that topic, but I do want to touch back on some of the military experiences that you had. You've mentioned to me, on the side, some of your deployments. The one that stood out to me was one that was sort of a false start, right? You were going to be deployed to Rwanda.
Yeah, right.
Do you mind walking through that? And then I have some questions on that.
Yeah, I would say, and just to correct the record,
Sure.
I wasn't deployed into a combat zone, so I was stationed, multiple places. But
Okay.
I was in this donut hole of we were not at war when I was in active duty, but after I got out of active duty, 6 months later, our unit went downrange to Bosnia, and we're in that conflict. But when I was in, and this is 1994, I was stationed in Germany. I was in the transportation unit as a platoon leader. Our unit was put on alert and our bags were packed, ready to go down to Rwanda. If you, for those who don't know what was going on there was a genocide that happened after government was toppled. There was two different tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis, that there's a lot of bad blood. So I won't go into all the history there, but basically 800,000 people were killed, many of them by machete, and it created an extremely terrible humanitarian crisis down there in Rwanda. Now, I'd never heard of Rwanda
right
at the time, and so I had to get spun up on that really quickly. The punchline is I never ended up going because last minute President Clinton decided to not send anybody there. But our mission was going to be bringing what they call ROPUs, it's reverse osmosis water purification units, down to Rwanda to basically purify water so that these refugees can have something to drink, right? And we didn't end up going because of the political and the geopolitical situation, but it was an interesting process to even go through to, first of all, okay, where am I going? I was newly married. And so talking to my wife about, hey, I'm going to go and I don't know how long it's going to be. And so that was an interesting mental preparation. And then at the end of it, for the mission to be, the plug to be pulled on it, that was just a really sort of weird, interesting emotions. I can't say I've gone through the emotions of actually having been deployed to a war zone like Afghanistan or Iraq. It's just the timing wasn't like that for me. But the closest I came was just going to Rwanda. And it wasn't going to be a dangerous situation necessarily, but it was going to be more of like, using the military's resources to go help people.
Yeah, which I think is a great use of the military resources.
Yeah,
personally,
I agree.
Part of my question next ends up being preparing yourself not just for being in a place you'd never heard of previously in the midst of a humanitarian crisis and not knowing how long you might be there, but preparing yourself for what you may or may not encounter in that process.
Yeah.
Was there soul searching? Was there fear? I mean, there must have been on both fronts. And then is there a way of steeling yourself against what you may encounter? Or is it an acceptance of you're going to see some things?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think at the time I even had the time to really be that introspective, because it was more of like, okay, because I had a platoon that I was in charge of,
Right.
like making sure everybody's ready to go, right?
Right.
And so as a leader, you don't have that time that often to like, okay, to self-reflect. It's more like, hey, gotta make sure we're ready, guys.
Yeah.
Um, I would say that it is a weird kind of like numb feeling, I guess, personally, that I went through. Like, wow, this is happening, isn't it? And I guess by going in the military, going to West Point, that that's going to be a possibility, right? So you're kind of mentally prepared for it, but like when you're in it, it's almost like you're watching your life happen in front of you.
Yeah.
Like you're an observer to your own life. Like, wow, this is wild. I'm doing this, but you definitely feel the emotions. But I can sit, it's been 30 years, but I think I felt kind of numb at the time more than anything else.
I almost wonder, and that's really, to me, a sort of insightful element that also leads into the preparation that the military provides, where you don't necessarily know where you're going to go, and you have to be prepared to just go and not ask questions, but not in a negative way, because if you start asking questions, you may not be as effective at the job, and they've prepared you for a lot of things. So there may be some muscle memory, there may be some rote acceptance in play. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way of characterizing it.
It's also really well structured, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you can see why the military can be effective, because the mission is not it's not created or outlined by the unit level commanders. It's a civilian run organization at the end of it.
Always forget that.
Right. And so as the president's the commander in chief,
right?
And a general can't just say, "Hey, I'm going to go take my division and I'm going to go invade X country, or even defend ourselves against X country." It's a civilian-run organization on purpose, and that's the way it should be. But you can see like subunit, like individual unit commanders, are basically just doing what they're told, and there's something good about that. But I think where that breaks down is if what they're being told to do is ultimately immoral, and so we talked about that a little bit earlier, but that has happened as well.
Mm-hmm. Glad I asked that. I hadn't thought about it that way. I think we've beaten the military drum to death at this point, but I still think there's a lot of room to discuss, faith or spirituality, or actually, how would you draw the distinction between faith and spirituality? It's a topic that I wrestle with a lot, because I don't necessarily enjoy the construct of faith. And I think you put it fairly well earlier. But when you look at your, let's call it the religion, when you look at your views on Christianity, God, Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
do you think of that in terms of spiritual belief, or how do you perceive of that for yourself? I know we're getting into semantics here.
No, yeah, and I would even use that term. It is semantics, because I think these kind of words can almost like cloud what's actually going on. Like that's why I don't like the word faith. Right. Even the word Christian these days, I don't like it. And the earliest quote Christians were what they called the way, right? They were followers of Jesus, right?
I know that.
And Christian has evolved to the point where now it's an adjective almost, like Christian music, Christian movies, Christian.
It's a marketing.
And I do not like that. And it almost gives a feeling of something that's substandard.
Oh, like interesting.
And cheesy, as opposed to I'm a follower of Jesus. And by the way, every religion seems to want to claim Jesus because he's got such credibility, right?
Yeah.
Eastern religions, Muslims, and every New Age, this like the Jesus concept and all that. It really seems to nobody really has a beef with Christians. I would say nobody. I
Well,
wouldn't say nobody. By and large, he's extremely respected, even as a historical and a quote spiritual figure.
yeah,
But even the term spiritual is kind of loaded because it just makes it feel like this other kind of realm that you go into, as opposed to it is my identity and it is my life. I am as a Christian, I am indwelt by the Holy Spirit, so I am quote spiritual all the time. It's not
right.
a mode I go into.
And spirituality being another loaded framework.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like spirituality just feels like, okay, I'm going to go into my woo-woo land and I'm going to go out into the desert and go meditate, as opposed to
I feel personally attacked. Go on.
nothing wrong with that.
I'm kidding.
Just, but if it's just compartmentalized into different like events, as opposed to this is who I am,
Right.
then I think that term does a disservice. Am I spiritual? Absolutely. I'm spiritual because I'm indwelled by the Spirit of God, and
Right.
and I'm not just a meat machine. I'm a soul that is with an integrated body that's been given to me, and my soul is my spirit, right? And so, and it's my soul who thinks. It's not my brain who thinks, right? It's my soul that pursues.
Now we're in my playground. Let's keep going.
Yeah,
I love this.
And you are not your brain.
Yeah.
And you can get a scalpel and dig deep into your brain, and you're not going to find the color red, right? You're going to find a processing unit that enables to interpret that signal from your optical nerve that then is perceived as redness. But red, you can't cut open your brain and find red, right? And so you are an enfleshed soul, right? And therefore, we are all spiritual in my mind.
There's a framework that you're touching on, which is actually extremely relevant both to the work that I do for money and the concepts that I find myself wrestling with or enjoying the back and forth on. When you're saying that you won't find the color red, what I think you could use to describe that is in the data world, what we are essentially doing is modeling reality. In linguistics, what we're essentially doing is trying to describe reality, but neither of those is actually reality.
Yes.
So it's just a model or a reference point with which we can use to understand reality. And it's one of my favorite ways of looking at this, because very frequently we find ourselves wed to the model or embracing that model as de facto reality.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of different places I could point to where people are describing this better than I will right now. But it's an easy trap to fall into, I find, where if we use our models, we use our data, we use the systems that we've developed in order to understand reality, we often confuse it with the actuality of reality.
Yes.
And we stop living in it, and we start forcing ourselves into very, very small containers when we have this capacity for so much more. You mentioned briefly, and I'm sorry, I'm just plowing ahead. You started to describe, I think, what you feel the soul is. And do you mind describing from your perspective or the way you view it?
The soul
what
is
the
the
soul is?
immaterial self. It is who you are. If you were just your body when you die, that's it. You're gone. The soul is what is animated and ultimately will be rejoined with their glorified bodies at the resurrection. But and think we all know innately that we are more than just our physical bodies, right? And that there's something beyond when our physical bodies actually die and are buried or cremated, whatever. There is something that persists on, and that is our soul, and that is our identity. And it is not defined by the four walls of what you can measure in a test tube, because that's the empiricist type of approach. And it's funny, I've talked to literally a panel of neuroscientists when I was actually over at the Center for Brain Health at an event, and they were using brain and mind synonymously.
Oh no.
And I checked them on it, like, you're using these things interchangeably, but clearly the mind is different than the brain. The mind is not just some epiphenomenon that emerges from the physical brain. There's something separate.
And a lot of people do believe that the mind is an emergent.
They do.
Yeah.
They do. And a lot of these guys honestly had never had that question posed to them before. Yeah, okay, let's just use the word brain. And these are like
That's surprising to me. That seems that should be a fundamental question they would be asking of themselves. Well, maybe not.
yeah, well, I don't think in their circles they're so
Sure.
interchangeable that they run in. But I put a little. I like to use that term. I put a little stone in their shoe. Like, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. Because even though the soul utilizes the soul and the mind is like a compartment of the soul, but it utilizes the brain for processing of information. Just because there's a correspondence doesn't mean that that's an identity. Identity does not mean correspondence.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of times those two things are conflated and it causes a lot of confusion. But the ultimate manifestation of that thinking is that, like Sam Harris would say, he's like, well, you have no free will. You have no free will because you're basically, everything you do is an output of some kind of input.
Right.
And therefore you do not have a will. You have no will, or you basically, everything is mechanical.
Right.
And that's terrible.
It's very depressing. I've spent years wrestling between determinism and free will, just on the, I guess, theoretical concepts of it. Because as a child, I was convinced that we could predict literally everything based on sufficient data inputs and observation of data outputs and finding those corresponding action-reaction events. And now I'm no longer so sure of that. And it's a fun one to wrestle with. What I found was that determinism tends to lead toward nihilism.
Yes.
And
ultimately it doesn't matter.
I see that as a negative. Not everybody does. But if nothing matters because you have no choice, then why do anything?
Well, ultimately, and if nothing eternally matters, if all you are is just basically a collection of neurons, and neurons and just meat that one day is going to disintegrate into nothingness, 300 million years from now, the universe won't know that you existed. It won't care.
Right.
And the universe is going to die a heat loss death ultimately because the energy, the law of thermodynamics,
right.
The universe is winding down, right? And therefore there's no real eternal value to anything under that kind of construct. And I think that's where Sam Harris and that kind of ilk go way wrong, is that they basically, their atheism, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to like create value and create moral frameworks when that doesn't really exist, when all it is just input and output. Like, what does moral even mean? What is good?
Right. Where do we even develop a framework for morality if we don't have that? And I've heard debates on this, and I've heard some compelling arguments, none of which are coming to mind as we're speaking at the moment, that morality can be separated from the concepts of faith or religion. I'm sorry to use the word faith again.
Yeah.
But it's sort of the parlance of our times, right?
I think at the end of the day, morals require a moral lawgiver, and I think they come from the creator, because otherwise it's just preferences. It's just different flavors of ice cream. It ultimately doesn't matter. It's just preferences. And why is it better for the human species to thrive as opposed to some ant species if it's all just, there are co-locations of cells, right?
Right.
And there's no ultimate value into humanity. And so I think it's a morally bankrupt philosophical framework. And it's not even scientific, it's philosophical. It's basically ruling out the existence of a soul. De facto.
I would be remiss if I didn't. You threw me some red meat there. I don't know if you intended to or not.
I didn't know.
No. It's coming up. Like one of the things you said was that we're more than our physical bodies, and I don't know if I've talked about this very much with you or at all on this podcast. I've spent some time at the Monroe Institute, and one of the core tenets when you're going through some of the meditative practices is I guess it's an affirmation or a statement that you make in your mind as you're going into these states. But the core premise is, I am more than my physical body. And a lot of the work that you do there actually shows you how much more you are than your physical body. And it's fascinating, the things that you can see and experience
Yes.
outside of your physical body. And it's it's difficult to quantify some of this. The closest I've come to being able to quantify it, I did one of their programs back in August. It's called Discovery, and they hook up EEGs to your head, and they measure the brain waves up to gamma, down to, I'm going to get this wrong, probably theta.
Okay.
And the various states when different signals are injected via audio in your headset with varying frequencies that cause a vibration that you can start to feel physically. And then they watch the measurements and the impact on the brain waves that are then measured as a result. And you can see different people having very different results based on how much meditation they've done, various experiences they've had in their lives. People who've had near-death experiences will have very different brainwave patterns and frequencies. And it's very compelling. And just a plug for my favorite place on the planet right now, the Monroe Institute is something that I would highly recommend anybody with questions on this to at least look up and think about going in and doing some of the work, or finding some of their tapes, buying them if you can. And
where is it?
It's outside of Charlottesville, Virginia.
Okay, got it.
And it was founded by a gentleman by the name of Robert Monroe, who had been, I believe, an NBC radio executive, who had started, I know it gets very woo here, but had found himself going out of body and was very curious about it and wanted to be scientifically minded. So he wrote a few books, and instead of injecting any spiritual language, new age language, because this was happening, I want to say the 60s, 70s, he wanted to be taken seriously. And so he took a very scientific approach to it. And it's one of my favorite subjects, and I spend a lot of time every day now going through and practicing and meditating with it.
Wow.
There are ample resources online. Sean Ryan has had several guests who have been largely foundational to the work at the Monroe Institute. One of my friends, one of my roommates from the Monroe Institute has been on Sean's show a couple of times, and he's a fascinating guy. Sorry, Mr. Webb. And it's fascinating. The people that you meet in various stages of life, it is everybody that shows up and has experiences.
Wow.
Well, not everybody has an experience every time. That's not the point. It's almost a proof of the soul, the extra physical experience of life.
Yeah.
And it's been very transformational for me. I've been familiar with him since I was maybe 25, and I finally went a couple of years ago because I had a little time off, as has been mentioned.
Yes.
And it was a very beautiful use of my time. Sorry for the extended plug for the Monroe Institute. I love that.
I love that. It just makes me think about, it's a little bit related, but think about my favorite guy. Christ said, what is it? Benefit a man if he gains the whole world, but he loses his soul. So.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. I hadn't heard that one. Anything else you'd like to go through? I have some other things that I'd be happy to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many different things. By the way, I'm just really loving this conversation. This is what people should be doing more and more, I think. At West Point, we have this, it's called the Cadet Prayer, and a part of it, it's just a little line that says, help us to live above the common level of life. Right.
Yeah.
I love that. It's just like these kind of conversations go beyond the common level of life. And I love these. So
likewise, I wish I could do this all day, every day. I'm working toward it.
Yeah.
Hey, 3 of these in the can, right?
Right. No, I just really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for letting me come and talk to you. Thanks for trusting me to have this conversation in the first place.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate you across the board. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.